Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Sunday, January 18th, 2026, and so we've been on the air now for over a year. And welcome to another installment of Thoughts and Reflections. This will be episode 6, but really it's the first episode in a little mini series or mini course that I'm going to be doing on mental health over the next several weeks. And so we're going to be talking then about taking control of your mental health. And so step 1 today. But let me start with a comparison. What if you were physically sick? Okay, you had a high fever. Even if you're not a medical doctor, most of us aren't. You know probably that a fever is just a temporary rise in the body's temperature. It's one aspect of the overall response of your physical body's immune system, usually caused by some kind of an infection. And if you have a high fever, you might have a variety of different symptoms, right? You might have obviously the raised temperature, but you might have sweating, you might have chills and shivering, headache, muscle aches, dehydration, general weakness, maybe difficulty with breathing or chest pains, perhaps vomiting, and so on. So the worst of our fevers and symptoms can be quite painful and cause a great deal of suffering. In fact, what do we say in plain English? I'm suffering from a fever. More broadly, I'm suffering from some kind of an illness. And what do we most immediately want? Well, if you've ever been sick, and I hate being sick, I don't know about you, we want an end to the suffering. And so to that end, we might at least, to help relieve the symptoms, we might take aspirin or Tylenol, consume vitamin C, drink fluids, get more rest and sleep, and so on. In other words, we'd like to regain our health as quickly as possible and stop suffering. And so it is with our minds and our mental health and its companion, mental illness, which are, of course, two sides of the same coin. If we're struggling with our mental health, we even use similar language, right? I'm suffering from depression. He's suffering from a mood disorder. She's suffering from schizophrenia. We're all suffering from whatever it is you might have in mind, seasonal affective disorder, and so on. Again, ideally, what do we want to do? We want to stop the suffering. So what can we do? Well, yeah, we could take aspirins and consume vitamin C and drink fluids and get more sleep. But will that stop the mental, emotional suffering? Well, those things can help, but the mental suffering comes at least in part from a different source, or perhaps additional source, in comparison with our purely physical suffering. So the body, of course, responds to this invasion of some kind of a pathogen, a parasite, a microbe, a superbug, whatever it is that's attacking you or attacking its host, targeting various bodily symptoms, and then kind of throwing them out of whack and making us sick, and we suffer accordingly. So in terms of mental illness, we might say that the mind's responding as well to an invasion of some kind of a pathogen, which might then have a genetic component. But it's a bit more complex because, at least in terms of modern brain science, most people agree that serious mental illness almost certainly stems from a combination of genetic predispositions and environmental factors. So stated another way, Tylenol or an intense regimen of vitamin C, these things alone cannot, cure or fix the mental illness. They could provide some relief, but the mind clearly is going to benefit from proper nutrients and more rest and so on. But stopping the suffering that's associated with mental illness requires something more, and at the very least, a different kind of intervention. And that's the first step, in my view, in terms of dealing with mental illness. But not even, or beyond just mental illness, even just your everyday anxieties and worries and stress and anger and much more. In other words, we can actually proactively deal with all of the precursors to the mental anguish and general suffering that most people, nearly everyone, myself included, tend to inflict upon themselves. And so where do we start? Well, simply put, we start by targeting or trying to reduce our own suffering, or especially the self-inflicted kinds of misery and agony and distress that we so often encounter. In fact, one of the first things I learned as a social work student back in the 1980s was that while stress is an inevitable feature of being human, distress refers to the severe, prolonged, and unmanageable kinds of stress that exceed our coping capacities and that have truly negative impacts. So distress can be certainly bodily in nature, right? But it can also come in the forms of mental and emotional distress. And in terms of our mental health, of course, it's the latter issues that are so often leading to our individual personal forms of suffering. So we cannot avoid stress, but we can definitely and directly reduce and manage, if not always eliminate completely, the distress that we encounter and we have to deal with, perhaps even on a daily basis. So, for example, if I'm walking up the stairs at work rather than the elevator, and I'm not used to walking up the stairs, what's going to happen? I'm going to tax my body physically. I'm going to encounter stress, more stress than usual. And for some people, that simple act of walking up the stairs, which again might be secondhand to other people, and people do it all the time, people who are acclimated to that, but it might lead to some serious distress, in terms of the strain on their legs and especially their heart muscles. They're just not used to it. Could they get used to it? Could they learn to cope in time? Of course, and with practice, with building up their muscles, including that all-important heart muscle. They could also train their minds to better deal with the daily stress of having to go up the stairs. Or they could maybe advocate for getting an elevator fixed or having one installed if there were none. And then they could learn alternative strategies to using the stairs if there were alternatives available, like maybe getting an office on the ground floor or working more from home, or even, dare I say, changing jobs. And that last option might seem quite extreme. Changing jobs just because of stairs? Well, yes, in some cases. If I can't get up the stairs because there's no elevator or it's not a handicap-friendly environment, for example, then maybe I'd be better off, or I'd rather work somewhere else. So changing jobs can be a preferred option if I can't deal with the stress of that particular work environment, or if there just aren't any really good alternatives, right? Now, forget the elevator and the physical distress. Do you see parallels, though, in terms of changing jobs if you're experiencing serious mental or emotional distress? In the extreme, if you're suffering in your job, you're experiencing a really toxic work environment, it might make really good sense, if it were possible, to try to change jobs. And of course, if you cannot change your job, then you're faced with a different kind of question. Well, what can you do then to reduce the suffering that you're experiencing at your workplace? What do you have the most control over? What can you do to most directly affect and reduce the suffering that you're experiencing? Well, the thing over which you have the most control would be your mind and your thought patterns. And of course, that's true of all forms of suffering, regardless of whether we're talking about the stuff that's happening at work or at school or at home in terms of your family and relationships. And the single most important thing that you can do with the suffering that you're experiencing, think about that question for a moment, okay? What's the single one thing or the most important thing that you can do to reduce the suffering that you're experiencing? How would you answer that question? Seriously. Have you got an answer? Well, there's really a pretty simple answer that's pretty universal in nature. The simplest and most direct and immediate way to reduce your suffering involves letting go. Did you get it? Did you come up with that or something like that, perhaps? Yes, if I could give the world and every single person on the planet one piece of advice in their language of understanding, of course, before I die, it would be, and that is before I die for the last time, that permanently, my advice would be to let go. No, it's not an original thought. It's almost impossible to come up with a truly original thought. Rather, my advice here is ultimately based on the many sages and spiritual teachers of the past, of my lifetime of reading and learning, whatever's manifested as well in today's modern writings and teaching of, if you will, contemporary shamans and healers in spiritual teachers of every kind. It's one of the few bits of advice and wisdom, if you will, that I believe is truly universal in nature. And I use that term universal intentionally because once you genuinely recognize that you're part of the universe's tapestry, that you yourself are woven into the very fabric and the essence of the universe, then you will be able to let go of real pain and suffering. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's not get too spiritual at this moment, right? What do we really mean when we're talking about letting go of pain and suffering? Well, again, let's say from a Buddhist perspective, although this is, again, truly universal, but the Buddhists have an obvious and very simple or direct answer to that question of letting go of suffering. That's to be enlightened or to become enlightened, okay? So that simply means, literally, enlightenment within the Buddhist framework means the end of suffering. And doesn't that resonate deeply, whether you're Buddhist or not or whatever, doesn't that resonate with our own understanding of our mental health? So if you could let go of emotional or mental pain and suffering, wouldn't you be much better off and much healthier? Of course. Now, you can't eliminate bad things from happening, however much you might plan, prepare, and protect yourself and your loved ones. But from a mental health perspective, you can take more control over how you recognize, respond, and react to reality. And much of that reaction involves letting go. So briefly, if I could return to the Buddhism example, yes, there's an actual aim or a goal that we humans are supposed to be striving for. But it's not about money or status or maintaining our good looks or personal accomplishments or anything like that. In Buddhism, it's the achievement of a profound state of wisdom or the liberation from suffering. Again, referred to as samsara. So how do we do that? Well, by understanding the true nature of reality, which involves a lot of things. There's a lot to unpack there. Not today, but over time and with repeated visits to the wellspring of knowledge and wisdom and in future sessions. But let's start simple today. How can you immediately start to manage and even modestly reduce your suffering? Literally today, what can you do? Now, none of us can just simply, flip a switch or plug in a cord and then fully and instantly be enlightened. As an analogy, imagine if you were wanting to be an amazing guitar player, okay? Maybe even world class. How could you do that? Well, if I wanted to become a great guitar player, I could, for example, pick up a guitar, right? And I could start playing whatever, right? But just playing the guitar, and even if I started practicing a lot today and gave it several hours, whatever, I could start playing. But of course, I'm not going to become all that good, and I'm certainly not going to be great in a day after practicing, or a week, or a year, or it's going to take literally several years in order, if you wanted to truly become a great guitar player, right? You can't just imagine being a great guitar player and voila, it happens. Right? I've been playing guitar for years and I'm still not a great guitar player. But alas, at the very least, you have to pick up the guitar, right? That's merely the first step. So let's, if you will, pick up the guitar together and see where we're at, okay? Where are we on the journey, metaphorically, to becoming a great guitar player? Now, I've written and recorded a whole album, as some of you know, but that's just the first chapter, not the last, and it's certainly not the end of my journey as a guitar player. There's much more to come, literally, and I intend to become a much better guitar player by the end of 2026, at the end of this year. Why? Well, in part, to reduce my own suffering as a musician. Beating myself up over what I can't do, my limitations, how I can't play this or I can't play that, or especially eliminated from my vocabulary. Gee, I wish I could, but I can't. Right? And Dr. J, okay, wait a minute. From a Buddhist perspective, why not just let go of wanting to play the guitar? And yes, that's an option, okay? But it's not about my being a great guitar player or wanting to be rich or famous or loved or admired for my music or whatever. I play guitar and I aspire to improve my playing because it's part of how I express myself. It's part of my very being and what I enjoy doing. So I'm just one of over 8 billion people on the planet, just as you are, that are alive today. Okay. And I have some agency and choice, as do you, in terms of how I'd like to express myself while I'm here. Again, so do you. But what does any of this have to do with mental health and suffering and enlightenment? Everything. After all, I've been on this road towards enlightenment for almost 64 years now, with many fits and starts along the way and many detours, and I'm still not there. But again, if you truly hope to end the suffering within yourself, if not in the world as a whole, then you have to start somewhere. And that's where we are, at the start. We're on page 1 of the first chapter. We've just picked up the guitar, and I don't want to overwhelm you. So again, while obviously many people are musicians, they do play different instruments, they do write songs, and of course some are world class and so on. But the point is that most people are not active musicians and don't intend to use music as the main medium of expressing themselves and so on. So there's tremendous creative diversity out there in terms of how people ultimately want to live their lives, express themselves and so on. And if I can use a different term, what I would say is that we as human beings all vibrate differently, or have our own, if you will, vibrations as beings. So we're all vibrating and giving off energy. And in our music, in our speaking, in our doings, in our very being ourselves. So the first step then involves identifying your own voice and the source of your own vibrations. And if that sounds too airy-fairy or spiritual or even meaningless, think of it this way. What does Jules sing at the beginning? What's the opening line of her song, Hands? Some of you will know the song. Maybe I'll leave a link below. If I could tell the world just one thing, it would be that we're all okay. And not to worry, because worry is wasteful and useless in times like these. Those are the opening couple of lines from her song, right? And so what's she saying right from the start? She's saying, let go of worry. And I think that's a great place to start, since we waste so much time and energy worrying about things, big and small, important and unimportant. And all that worrying mainly just drains us of our energy and essentially gets us nowhere. As Jules stated, the worry is wasteful and useless. But it's even worse than that. It creates undue stress and even distress in our lives. That perpetual tendency that so many of us have to worry about things that have happened in the past, that are happening right now, that might happen in the future. And all that's a huge burden or weight that we're constantly carrying with us. Again, what happens if you're carrying a heavy knapsack on your shoulders, right? And you're hiking up a mountain? You're going to get very tired. It's stressful at the beginning, and eventually it might lead to real distress, discomfort, and suffering along the way. So how do we relieve the suffering, the heavy weight that's on our shoulders? We have to lighten our load. We have to discard some of the unnecessary items that are weighing us down, that we're carrying with us up that mountain. And so it is with worrying, at least metaphorically. How much are our worries weighing us down, causing distress, and then adversely affecting our mental health? Far more than most people even realize, I believe. And so that's where we start. But wait, Dr. J, we all have responsibilities. We all have to worry about things and get things done. We can't just not care and not do anything. Absolutely. But caring is not the same thing as worrying. Of course we care. and especially if we want to be ultimately an expression of love. Caring and loving are inseparable. I'd never advise you to stop caring, just as I'd never advise you to stop loving. Instead, I'm talking about the need to let go of the unnecessary and counterproductive worrying that so many of us do. The daily worrying that creates so much self-imposed suffering. Let me use one, again, final, very simple example that really for most of us is quite trivial, right? You like a certain sports team. You really want them to win. The Blue Jays, my team, were literally one step short, even inches, if you will, of winning the World Series. But their runner got tagged out at the plate. They would have won the series. And then they ended up losing the series the next inning, or maybe the one after that. I'd have to look it up again. Heartbreaking. Imagine you like the Buffalo Bills, and you watched them yesterday, and you worried about whether they were going to win or not. Spoiler alert. Yeah, they ended up losing in overtime to the Denver Broncos. But if their receiver, Brendan Brooks, had caught the ball in overtime that was thrown to him near the Denver 20-yard line, something close to there, anyway, they likely would have just been able to then kick a field goal, and they would have won the game and advanced to the conference final. But the ruling ended up being on the field that the Denver player, Jaquan McMillan, stripped him of the ball at the last second or as they were hitting the ground, and they ruled it an interception instead. Long story short, Denver got the ball, drove down the field, kicked a field goal, they won. And that's yet another example of sports kind of being a metaphor for life's ups and downs. How many people literally suffer because their team didn't win? And even worse, or especially if they feel like their team was screwed over by the refs, by a blown call or whatever, and they're mad as hell because that's just not fair. And don't misunderstand me. Sometimes life isn't fair by objective standards. And yet, regardless, we need to then be able to let go, because if we don't, we're going to suffer, okay? And then potentially that's going to affect our mental health. Okay, and so that's where we're going to pick up next week, in week 2 or lesson 2, however you want to frame it. How do we actively then how do we start to let go and reduce our suffering? So stay tuned. In the meantime, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs and caring in abundance. Peace.